Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed. I'm Arjuna, and this is the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. Today, Eastern theology is going to be meeting Western theology. Our guests today are Keith Ward and Kenneth Valpy, also known as Krishna Kshetra Swami. Keith Ward is a British philosopher, theologian, and Anglican priest who has held various positions, including Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford University. His books include Why There Almost Certainly Is a God and More Than Matter. He has been awarded honorary doctorates from the University of Amsterdam, the University of Glasgow, and Virginia Theological Seminary. He is a member of the Board of Governors of the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. He is well known for his work in the field of metaphysics, in which he makes a case for idealism, and for his focus on interfaith dialogues and comparative theology. Dr. Kenneth Valpy is a research fellow at Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, a fellow at the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics, and Dean of Studies at Bhaktivedanta College in Belgium. As a practicing monk in the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition of Krishna Bhakti, he's been engaged since 1972 in the study and teaching of Indic cultural and religious ideas and practices, with an emphasis on comparative, integrative understanding of Dharmic traditions and a concern to relate these with contemporary cultures. After completing his doctorate of philosophy at the University of Oxford with a study of Vaishnava temple liturgical practices and theology, he's been participating in an extended study of classical Sanskrit text, the Bhagavad Purana. His most recent works include an extended study of the classical Sanskrit text, the Bhagavad Purana, and a monograph of cow care in Hindu and animal ethics. So, Keith and Kenneth, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Okay, my pleasure.
It's an honor.
We know each other quite well, Kenneth. Really.
We do, and
yeah, great.
I want to say, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been able to come to Oxford.
Right.
You opened the door for me personally, and you also opened the door for the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. So
yeah, I was delighted to do that. One of the ironies is that in Oxford I taught a course on religion, the study of religion, and I found that my Vaishnava students often knew more about Christianity than my Christian students, so that was very interesting.
Right. So, yeah, I just wanted to host a comparative religion discussion on hermeneutics, and I just asked Ryan Mullins, who would be a good academic for this? And one of the two names recommended was Keith Ward. I looked him up, invited the two guests on, and it turns out they know each other because Kenneth Valpy was one of Keith Ward's students at Oxford University. So that's an interesting coincidence. So our advertised topic today is hermeneutics, which often bleeds over into epistemology. So I've noticed from reading Keith Ward's book on science that he was making some points that the qualification of the person having a religious experience matters. I assume that also applies for reading the Bible too. Would you like to comment on that, Keith?
Yeah, I mean, I presume the word hermeneutics means how you interpret the words of a holy text. Isn't that right? Is that how you'd understand it? How do you interpret the words?
Yeah, that's generally how it's used.
Yeah. Do you take them literally or metaphorically or in some other symbolic way? And I think a difficulty for Christians in particular is that a lot of Christians tend to take words in the Bible literally and as if they're true historically. And some even say that the Bible was written by God, which I regard as an entirely misleading statement, because it was written over hundreds of years by lots of different people, which is not to say it wasn't inspired by God. But here's perhaps the first major point for a Christian, that although lots of Christians think you should just interpret these words as if God had spoken them directly to you, in fact, the Bible, of course, is written in Hebrew and Greek, and the words of Jesus were in Aramaic, which is hardly recorded at all in the Bible. So the link between the divine God and the words on the page written by many different people in Hebrew and Greek, which most people don't read anyway. The question of interpretation is very difficult, because how do we know what Greek words from 2,000 years ago meant to the people who wrote them or read them then? Do they mean the same as they do now? And I think the answer is clearly no. So that's perhaps enough on that. There's just a huge difficulty of knowing how to interpret texts which are translated from languages which we don't really have a very clear grasp of. Well,
Do you want to comment on that, Kenneth?
Well, okay. Yeah, the challenges of hermeneutics involve certainly the question of just translation of texts. I was fortunate, I would say, to have a wonderful experience doing some translation of excerpts from the Bhagavata Purana. I worked together with my colleague Ravi Gupta, and I think you, Keith, will remember Ravi as well, since we were both in your same course at the same time. And the challenges involved are very much as you say. What do these words mean in this context? Composed possibly, and even the question of when it is composed is there. The tradition claims 5,000 years ago. Modern Indology is doubtful of that, and so on. Having said that, there is a sense within the Vaishnava tradition that we can be clear of meanings through what is called Guru Parampara, through the system of the channel, so to say, of transmission. And it's interesting to see that within that tradition, the Parampara system, there will be different perspectives. So it can happen that one interpreter will have a different interpretation than another. And what can also happen, and this makes it, I would say, kind of especially fun, the translation process especially from Sanskrit. Take, for example, the very first verse of the Bhagavata Purana, the Srimad Bhagavatam. One of the highly respected commentators from the 18th century, Vishwanath Chakravarti, composed no less than 5 different translations of the same text. He took the same words and he said, well, you can take it as, this word, Janmadyasya yataha, the beginning of the verse. You can take it as meaning the creation of the world, but you can also take it as meaning the beginning of the process of aesthetic relish, what is called rasa. And like that. So he plays with, he openly says, you can take it this way, you can also take it this way, and why not a third and a fourth and a fifth way as well? And he doesn't have a problem with that. And so there can be different interpretations accommodated.
Yeah, I think you can see a very similar thing in the first words of the Bible, which are, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So in the beginning. And in the beginning could mean in the beginning of everything. I mean, there was nothing before that. Or it could mean in the beginning of this universe, though there have been other universes than this. And so the text itself doesn't tell you what it means, the beginning of what. And there are similar arguments about was there a primitive chaos in the Bible? The Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters, the tohu vabohu, the great deep in Hebrew. And does that mean there was a great deep before God shaped it into the world? Or does it mean no, God created the deep as well? So though, if you look at the text, you simply cannot tell just by reading it which of those interpretations are correct. And I think, again, a similarity with what you're saying is there are traditions of interpretation within Christianity. So John Calvin, a Protestant, has one way of interpreting these. He was a very good scholar of Hebrew, but he has a different way of interpreting it from Thomas Aquinas, for example. So there are different schools of interpretation. And you have to say, one problem that Christians have is they don't always know that. They think there's the one they've been taught when they were young. That's the only interpretation there is. And yeah, so yeah, that's they never get beyond Sunday school. That's a big problem.
Yes, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think somehow the way that revealed texts come to us leaves open the possibility of variety of interpretation. And I think that's very important to say. There's not just one truth, which is obvious, it's clear, there's no argument about it, that's it, that's what it means. But somehow our traditions, I think both in Sanskrit, certainly in Hebrew and in Greek, leave open the possibility of quite different interpretations, though we could all accept the text. Right.
Can we also say that
Oh, your sound's a little funny.
There's some echo there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that it in my case, or
it's better now. It might just be an internet thing. It's all right now. Go.
I can hear it.
Can we also say that the entire, I think it is said in the tradition that the New Testament is in itself an interpretation of what Christians came to call the Old Testament?
Yeah, it certainly involves that. I mean, the most obvious example is that it is virtually certain, as certain as anything in the New Testament, that Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, which in Greek is basileia theou, which you could translate as the rule of God. Anyway, the fact is that nowhere in the New Testament does it tell you what the kingdom of God is. So you have to read the Old Testament to find out how that concept might have originated. And, so again, it's not, when you get people, evangelists on American television saying this is what the text means, and they're always wrong. I mean, they're always wrong. Because the text doesn't just mean that. You have to look at the individual words in the light of a whole history of interpretation and of reading, which is very complicated and manifold. And I think this is great because I would want to read. Well, I can't read Sanskrit, Kenneth. I'm sorry to say. I've had a look, and it's very difficult. Greek's enough for me, and Hebrew, I draw a line after that. I just haven't got time.
Well, I can't read Greek or Hebrew, so there you go.
Yeah, but I think there are lots of possibilities of saying these different languages actually can be interpreted as converging much more than the traditions have come to say they do. When some Christians say Hindus all believe in millions of gods, so they're all polytheists. Well, that's just a lack of, it's sheer ignorance, really. But it's come to be generally accepted, whereas I certainly find in Vaishnava theology a lot of convergences of thought about the
Yeah.
love of the supreme being. And I think the Vaishnava tradition can cast a different, a new and exciting perspective on what that sort of love actually means. Right. So I think the interpretation can work, not just, you just read the Hebrew and try and find out what they meant, but also talk to somebody who reads Sanskrit and see if there are interpretations which are convergent, which converge on a spiritual outlook, rather than the ones which say, oh, these are all different, and furthermore, one of them is wrong, and mine is right. I think for me, that's the worst sort of hermeneutics, the worst sort of interpretation, which says there's only one correct interpretation, and I know what it is.
And the rest of the world got it wrong.
They're all wrong.
So one modern idea you get, is that an artist or a poet could create something, and then the viewer of the art or the reader of the poetry, they can find some meaning in it that wasn't put there by the artist. So I've heard in the Vaishnava tradition, this idea is rejected. So if you read a poem, the only ideas that can be contained in the poem are ones put there by the author. So if there's multiple interpretations which are valid from a line of scripture, those were intended and they were put there. Would that be accurate?
Not completely.
Okay.
There's some truth there, but one thing we have to remember is that a good percentage, a huge percentage of what we may call the Vedic corpus in the broadest sense is poetry. It's composed in poetic meter, and also the one of the terms for Brahma, who is considered to be like the cosmic engineer, he's referred to as Adi Kavi, and the primordial poet, or the original poet. The term kavi can also mean philosopher. So from that perspective, if we think what is poetry, I would say it's the sort of height of linguistic expression, which has as its purpose opening to depth of feeling. And our whole tradition, the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, is all about feeling. It's all about rasa. It's all about aesthetic emotion experience, which is evoked especially by sacred poetry. And ultimately, you have philosophically or theologically speaking, there are infinite souls or jivas, and each one is called upon. We talked about this, Arjuna, last time, this little formula that Narottam Das gives us: sadhu, shastra, guru vakya, hridaye, koriya, aikya. He says, I pray that all of the words of the sages, sadhu, the shastra, meaning the sacred texts, and the guru, my personal teacher, or guide or mentor, hridaye, koriya, aikya, that they become a singularity, an aikya, in my heart, that I have a clear vision within my heart. It's not saying, let everyone, or may everyone have the same vision. It says, may I have a clear vision from them.
Yep, I agree entirely with that. I think the Hebrew is also in the Bible very poetic. It uses words which don't have a clear meaning, like the word eternity, for example. I mean, some very crude philosopher might say, oh, the word eternity means timeless, and that means it doesn't change, there's no time at all. But actually, the word eternity has a much greater, it's like the word spirituality. If you say, what exactly does that mean? Well, it doesn't exactly mean anything, but it evokes all sorts of feelings, and certainly thought there is more to life than just material interests. It certainly means that. But the essence of poetic language is that it is not just having one meaning. It involves the reader or the hearer in a personal adventure of understanding. I agree entirely. It's how it changes the heart. But it's not like saying, how did the dinosaurs get into the ark, or didn't they? Or how must their door have been? And you give a scientific expression. What speed was Jesus going when he ascended into heaven? And you say, something's gone wrong. So the poetry is quite different. And you say, well, essentially, it's Jesus sitting at the right hand of God. You think, well, did God have a left hand as well? And who was there? It's gone wrong somehow, because you're saying something like Jesus had divine authority in his context. So the other thing I just thought about what you said, Arjuna, about what the writer intends. There is a thing in literature called the intentionalist fallacy, which I'm sure you know, but the intention, it's not necessarily a fallacy, just so to say it is. The intentionalist fallacy is to think that what a poem means is what the writer of the poem intended it to mean. So, and that's a fallacy, it's a mistake, because it doesn't matter much what the writer intended. What matters is what is there on the page and how you respond to it. And that might be in a way which the writer had never even imagined. But you're still learning from that poem something valuable. In other words, you can never anyway know what a poet or a writer intended. You can't get into their head, into their mind. So it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake too, but it's only one point of view. It's a mistake to say that what a poem or a holy text means is whatever the writer, if the writer was a human being, whatever the writer intended it to mean. The intention is A, unobtainable. We never find out what it is. And B, it's not the point of the writing anyway. It's not to show somebody's intention. Is to say something which will evoke in you. The writer might have no idea what.
So the meaning that people get out of it could be intended by God and just divinely inspired into the author. So the author might not have had the intent, but God has placed that meaning there for you to discover.
That might be true, but why would you think that God had only one thing that God intended to say and just said it so that it couldn't be misunderstood?
Oh, no. So if there's 20 meanings that are valid meanings, God could put 20 meanings in one line of text because he's far more clever than we can, and he can, achieve things like that.
Well, look, we're talking about hermeneutics here, right? So the question, there's a very famous philosophy book called The Meaning of Meaning, right? It's a really stupid title, really. But the meaning of meaning asks the question, what does meaning mean? Right? What is it to mean something? Right? And I'm talking now, and am I intending just one thing that I know clearly what it is and I want you to get it? No. Words are coming out of me and I'm thinking, did I really mean that? Right? Or perhaps they come out of me and I'm not sure what they mean. Right? But they're still coming out and they have a meaning. But what is a meaning? I'm suggesting to you a meaning is what somebody takes a symbol to express. So that it's never the case that one word has one meaning. Okay.
I'm reminded in this regard, possibly, maybe it's tangential, but I'm reminded of Ramanuja. I know you're familiar with Ramanuja Acharya, Keith, who of course was not happy with the Advaita idea of a kind of ultimate, some sort of ultimate singularity. And so he emphasized that God is described by language, and indeed that every word is, he was very radical, I think, as I understand him, maybe I misunderstood, but from translations I've read, that every word in any language is, in some sense at least, a name of God.
Yeah.
That every possibility of meaning that we get has something to say about the character, the nature of God.
So,
Okay.
It's all silent.
That's a very poetic thought.
Yes.
And if I sit here and ask, what does that mean? I get the impression it's very profound, but I don't know what it means. Right. So I say, this is a table. Yes. What's that got to do with God? Now, it probably does have something to do with God, but it's not clear to me what. And it leaves open. It opens up for me possibilities of seeing things in a new way. And so meaning is social. All right, let's try that one. For a word to have meaning, we're all speaking English at the moment.
Mm.
So there's a little society of which we are part, of English speakers. We're still going to differ a bit about what we think English words mean. But on the whole, we understand them quite well. But getting the meaning is becoming part of a particular group. Can I put it that way? The meaning is not something the word stands for, just like that, just one thing. The meaning is a group activity of communication between different minds. And the meaning will differ according to the group you're in. Right.
Isn't this about the idea of language as being meaningful by convention?
Yes, very close to that. In fact, the philosopher I have in mind here is Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Oh, yes. Good old Ludwig.
Yeah, good old Ludwig. And he used to say, don't ask for the meaning, that is what the word stands for, but ask for the use, namely, how is the word used in this community?
Uh-huh.
Right. So if you say, hi there, how are you? And you say, what's the meaning of that? It doesn't stand for anything. It's just, it has a use in a particular community. And another community might not understand it or might not use it. If I say hi, they might think it's rude. If I meet someone, I say hi, they'll think, oh, that's too informal. I don't like that. So it depends on the community and this is where interpretation comes in. Each community has a slightly different interpretation because it's the activity. The meaning is the activity of communicating in that community. Right? So it's not the picture of word stands for thing. It's that word expresses a social relationship in a particular group. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. I can, as we say in America, I can relate to it. But perhaps by contrast, it's interesting to look at, since you just mentioned language communities, there was in early centuries of the Common Era in India a language community which developed a philosophy about language. Actually, there were two. There were the so-called grammarians, and there were the Mimamsakas. And as I understand, both of them considered Sanskrit language in a very different way from what you are speaking. They considered Sanskrit as a kind of absolute language where indeed words have a kind of absolute meaning, which is not for us to, to dally with, or what do I want to say? It is what it is. But the irony, I think, with the Mimamsas in particular is that this is also regarded as the school of interpretation, where their whole aim in life was to try to determine what the message was of the Veda, the Rig Veda in particular, or other Vedic texts. So that's a very different understanding of language. And then maybe somewhere in between, in the aesthetic tradition, the Sanskrit aesthetic tradition, as I understand, there's sort of three ways of understanding a statement. There's the denotative meaning, there's the connotative meaning, and there's the suggestive meaning. And the classical example of this is Gangayam Goshaha, which means literally the village on the Ganges River. And one hears this and thinks, village on a river? That doesn't make sense. Okay, so it must mean a village on the bank of the Ganga. So that becomes the connotative meaning. But then the idea is to go to the poetic understanding, the dvani, the suggested meaning, and that's where poetry especially is prominent. And here the idea is, okay, village on the Ganga, on the Ganges River, that means that it's a very, there are cool breezes, and so the place is very pleasant. So without using the word breeze, without using the word cool, none of the words which are giving the idea are nonetheless implied in the expression. So yeah. I'm just trying to say there seems like there's a whole spectrum of understandings of where meaning may lie.
Yes, there is. I agree with that. That's very helpful. And there's also the point that if we're going to talk about the supreme being, maybe language is never going to give a direct reference to something that is true as we understand it. So that whatever you say about the Supreme Being is never going to be exactly formulatable. We can only. Let me try to think an example. Sorry?
We can only approximate.
We can only approximate. Yes, that's right. And we can never, if you say God knows everything, for example, we could never imagine what that would be like for God to know everything. I mean, does God know the things that we're thinking now? Because how could any being know what's in my mind? Well, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I can never get a clear idea of what it would be like for that to be true. So I can say it's true, but I can't say I know exactly what it's like to be true. And I think a lot of religious languages like that. It can't. One Christian theologian, Baron von Hugel, said actually, if you say something about God and you think you really understand it, then it's not God you're talking about.
You said something that reminded me of the title of a quite famous article amongst anthropologists, and all I remember is the title of the article. I don't remember the name of the author, but the article was titled, "What is it like to be a bat?"
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So what is it like to be God? Well, what is it like to be a bat?
Yeah, indeed.
What you just said about God, Keith, sounds like also a description of quantum physics. Because what Richard Feynman, who if anybody could understand quantum physics, it's him. He famously said that anyone who thinks they understand quantum physics doesn't understand it.
Yeah, that's right. And if that's true of physics, it's even more true about God, presumably the creator of all physics. So that immediately leads you to say, well, however you interpret holy texts, in the end, they're going to be beyond your understanding. And that seems to entail that any particular person's understanding of a holy text is only partial. It's never completely adequate. And if you accept that, that's quite important, really. It stops anybody saying, this is absolutely true, and what you say is absolutely false. That I think is the great heresy of religious believers, and indeed of everybody, to say, well, this is the truth, and about ultimate reality, and everybody else is wrong because I know what it is. And I think you can never say that.
Can we say that? Whoops, some echoes.
Some echoes.
It might come right. It seems to come right after you talk for a couple of seconds. I think because your internet's low, it doesn't send a signal unless you're actually talking, and then it takes a minute to come right.
Okay.
Yeah, no,
I was just thinking, it seems like, Keith, what you're calling for is, what do they call it? Epistemic humility?
Yeah, exactly. I would call it that, yes.
And you mentioned language as, if I'm misrepresenting, but as in some essential way falling short of giving us the reality of the supreme being. This leads me to think about another perspective that we see in the Vaishnava tradition with respect to mantra. Mantra is also, we can say, composed of words, and there's a sense in which, at least it's expressed in such a way, that there is a kind of non-difference between the referent and the language referring. And this is particularly said, abhinatvam nama namino. There's an abhinatva, there's a non-difference. And we may say, well, what does that mean, a non-difference? But there's a sense of a collapsing of the gap, or a closing of the gap between the object, in this case, the person, God, and the pronouncing the word which is seen as a name. And it's a big challenge for us to comprehend that, because we always think of language as designative of something else than itself, which to me calls me back to what you were saying before about our friend Ludwig Wittgenstein, that he says, don't try to look at the meaning of words directly, but at how they are used.
Yeah.
So in the Vaishnava tradition with mantra, the emphasis is on use of the mantra, meaning repetition of the mantra, hearing the sound. And of course, in Orthodox Christian traditions, there is especially emphasized the repetition of God's names, the Jesus prayer, I believe.
Yeah, yes.
Seems to be a common point of, as you said, convergence there.
Yeah, I think that's true. And so what does that say about this particular use of language? It says something about the use of language here is not to stand for something else, but to evoke in the speaker, the person who's using those words, a particular state of unity with the ultimate reality, which you don't go on to describe any further, because
yes, it's evoking. I still remember a comment you made in our class. You won't remember probably because you've had so many students.
Yes.
You had our small group over to your residence at Christ Church College, and I think it was a Sunday, and suddenly you said, "Oh, excuse me, I just realized I have to conduct the service in the cathedral. You're all welcome to come." And so we came and we attended the service, and it was very wonderful. And I still remember you said, and you can sing the songs. You don't have to believe them. When it comes to singing, you don't have to believe it.
That's right.
So we were all happily singing the hymns, although I found them very, very nice. They were glorifying. So that I'm mentioning this because, of course, song is also invoking. You use the word invoking, and I think this is very much what is going on, specifically with mantra. And I'm thinking specifically of the mantra for which the Hare Krishnas are so well known, the Hare Krishna mantra, because the Sanskrit, grammatically, the form of that mantra is the vocative case, which means you are calling to someone directly, which means you are invoking the person. So that idea is there. So I guess what I'm thinking is there's really quite a range of ways to understand how language works, how it's used, about different, as you said, depending very much on community, like if I go into a group of people somewhere in the next town here, Kamyanagora, and start talking about the Veda, even if I could speak fluent Polish, which I by no means can do, they would just look at me, which planet did you come from? No idea. But there is a sense also that that language is somehow special. In fact, Sanskrit is, the word Sanskrit is sometimes translated as Sanskrita, as purified or refined. It's a language which has a particular potency. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, but just some.
So my understanding of the idea that language falls short is that, like the Sanskrit language doesn't fall short, but English may. But Sanskrit language falls short to people who don't have the relevant concepts. It means nothing to, like, for example, if you want to tell somebody what it's like to eat a mango and they've never eaten a mango before, you just can't possibly describe it. But for people who have experienced love of God, then the Sanskrit language can perfectly describe what they've experienced because they have the concept that the words can evoke in their mind.
It could, but I think the point Keith's making is still valid. Even with Sanskrit, we can see that there are different styles of Sanskrit that have developed over time. There's early Vedic Sanskrit. In fact, one scholar insisted to me, he said, Vedic, don't call it Sanskrit, it's Vedic. Okay, then there's classical Sanskrit, and then there's medieval Sanskrit, and I don't know if there's modern Sanskrit. I mean, there are scholars who conduct lectures in Sanskrit in India, but there are changes in the language as well, at least in how it's used in a particular time and in a particular community. So it's not, it's often said Sanskrit is a dead language. Well, a dead language would mean a language which nobody speaks, it seems to me. But there are people who do speak Sanskrit. And understand when someone speaks and so on. So it's a living language, which means we may say also about language that it, by its nature, it is changing over time. So it's changing in terms of community, and it's also changing in terms of time. But again, the Vedic tradition insists that there is a timelessness to this transmission of the truths of Veda. So there's a tension there.
Yes, it's interesting when you look at different world faiths, they all seem to say the same sort of thing about their own language. But if you say, Arjuna, that Sanskrit is particularly appropriate to the Supreme Being, well, a Muslim would say, no, Arabic is absolutely the language. And a Jew would say, no, it's the Hebrew. That's clearly the language of God. So don't you think there's something a little bit odd about that?
Well, the difference is I'm right and they're wrong.
Yes. No, it says something about the importance of language, but that actually that importance doesn't lie in the unique capacity of a particular community language to convey the absolute truth. Right? It sounds more as though, I mean, there are people who think in the Christian church that Latin ought to be the language of worship, but I mean, if you're Greek, that's ridiculous. And it ought to be Greek. And if you're English, well, I don't know what you know about the English, but they think Elizabethan English, you know, thou art coming here, oh Lord. They think that sort of language, which nobody else speaks, of course, is the language of God. And they say, you can't change that language. It's absolutely, this is it, right? And well, let me give you this example. It's very interesting. People often say, when you talk about God as a Christian, you should say, thou, O Lord, art great. Thou art great. Now, the word thou is second person singular, like tu in French, you know, and it means you have a especially intimate relationship with the person. But actually, Christians don't think that's true. They think the word thou is used because it makes God an object of reverence, which is the opposite of what the word thou meant in the 16th century when people really used it. It's like saying, you, hey, you come here. So that word thou has completely changed its use. It used to mean, I know you well, I've got an intimate relationship, but now it means, oh, this is reserved for God. Thou, O Lord, art great. But you don't say, art thou coming to the cinema with me tonight? You know, so there's something odd about saying this language intrinsically carries the truth. I just think that's a bit odd. There are too many different people who think that.
Well, I mean, there's many people who think that their scientific hypothesis is correct. It doesn't mean that none of them are correct.
It's true, but it means that most of them are wrong.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
But I think there's something else here, and that is an impulse of looking for a sacred language. That language is, you know, we use it in everyday ways for all kinds of things. And perhaps it has also to do with a problem that's been recognized by anthropologists, which is that we human beings, and not only human beings, but animals, all kinds of animals, have different ways of enacting deception. But humans are especially adept at deception, and particularly through language. In other words, we know how to lie. And so there's a seeking for a language in which truth always somehow comes through, no matter what we do or think or say. It will descend. It will come through. The revelation will have its power, and there's a sense that let us find that language that works, that does that job. And as you're saying, the problem is everybody's saying, well, you're talking about my language, namely Arabic or whatever it is. I met some Amish people a couple of years ago, very nice people in Pennsylvania. And their sacred language is a kind of, 18th century German.
That's right.
So
I think the truth is that there are specific religious uses of language. I think in ordinary Sanskrit, when it was probably never used by ordinary people, it was only used by Brahmins, wasn't it? I think. And if there was an ordinary Sanskrit that you used in the marketplace, that wouldn't be thought of as particularly important. It's only when you give that language especially religious use. So you associate with certain rituals, with certain bodily postures, with certain states of mind. And it just seems to be that many different languages could have this sacred use, and it's the sacred use that matters rather than the grammar or the exact noises that you make when you speak, right? So it would seem to be a mistake to say this language. I mean, I'm a Christian and I know the New Testament was written in Greek, but I don't think Greek's particularly important. In fact, in the New Testament, some of the Greek is rather poor grammatically. It makes mistakes, grammatical mistakes. But there are some phrases which you get used to, which have that again, I go back to that word evoke or invoke. They have this invocative aspect, but that could be any language if you gave it that use. So I'm concentrating on. It's not the language. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Sanskrit, but it's not intrinsically better than Hebrew. Me.
So one question we could ask is if this could be examined empirically, like, for example, with Sanskrit, they find that people who memorize Sanskrit slokas, there's some benefits to their brain. Maybe they would get the same benefit memorizing slokas in any language that's possible. But also, one thing that's beautiful about Sanskrit is the grammatical flexibility. So you can take any word and turn it into a name, any kind of name. Any word can have any kind of word form. Whereas in English, when you're doing philosophy, often you'll want to use a word on all sides of your idea, but the word just lacks the grammar for you to be able to use it like that. So I heard a talk once where he was using a word and he's like, and here we ran out of the grammar, and then he just made up a use for the word, or the world to world and all its worldliness or something. Whereas in Sanskrit, you can do this. And in philosophy, it's nice to use the same word all the way through for clarity. But in English, often you'll have to, for the same idea, just change words because the grammar falls short.
Yeah, well, Americans have no difficulty with changing English into weird forms.
I beg your pardon.
I think there's a lot more convention about this. I mean, I'm sticking to the view that language is a matter of social convention, that there are particular religious conventions in many different languages, and I don't want to turn language into magic. I don't want to turn invoking language into a language of power where you're saying the words like in a magic spell will cause something to happen. I think that's a superstitious view, and we should move beyond that, really. Right. I'm not against Sanskrit. I don't speak it at all, but I would have thought. I mean, I read people like Ramanuja in English translation, obviously. Now, am I losing something? Well, yes, I'm losing something. It means I'm probably never able to really discover how that writer meant when he wrote those words. He was in such a different culture. But I can still have my own relationship to God transformed by those words. Right.
Yeah.
Even though they're translations.
Yeah. And Ramanuja in Sanskrit, that is very dense and very difficult Sanskrit, I have to say. But it reminds me, this point about conventional or super or magical. I'm reminded that many years ago in our society, my own preceptor, teacher, guru, Swami Prabhupada, was instructing one of his students, one of my colleagues, in some of the ritual practices that are done in the temple, which traditionally involved pronunciation of various Sanskrit mantras, prayers, and so on. And Swami Prabhupada said to him, "Don't worry about the Sanskrit. You can do it all in English if you like."
Right.
So he was that point is agreeing with your point that the language in itself as such need not be the only channel by which truth is acquired. I guess that's the point you're making.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But language, on the other side, without language, where are we? Isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think there's such a thing as the language of music. We've talked about poetry, but music is quite
And you
important
are
too. Music can evoke lots of states of mind, lots of sorts of feelings. It can even, many people think, tell you truths about the world, but they can't be put into words. I resonate with that. I think there's something in that because it's the activity associated with language which gives the meaning to the language. And if you don't participate in the activities, the language will never mean the same to you as it does to a participant. I think that's the important point, which I think has come out of our discussion actually, that are communities which have special uses of language, which can't be understood fully by people who don't participate in the activities, because how to say why.
Speaking of, I don't want to jump over your wonderful point about music, but the latter point that you just made about not understanding other communities, I think this is something which is a major challenge in today's world. And I, for one, have been especially appreciative of your own efforts in your many books. I read, I can't say how much of the 4 volumes you did on religion. You did religion and revelation, religion and community, religion and experience.
I can't remember really.
Anyway, you were trying to, communicate across these boundaries.
Yeah.
And the other scholar I was so fortunate to benefit from, who became really my main supervisor for the doctoral work, was Frank Clooney.
Oh yeah.
And I'm sure you had exchanges with him as well. That he is in quite fascinating ways bringing traditions together through what he calls comparative theology.
Yeah.
And his exposing me to comparative theology led me more recently to read a book by, I think her name is Michelle Voss Roberts, called Divine Tastes, in which she takes, she's making comparative exploration across Christian and Vaishnava traditions through the lens, not of language, not of sound, of music, so much as of taste, but not physical taste, but aesthetic taste.
Right.
And in the Vaishnava tradition, the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, we are especially reverential to Srila Rupa Goswami of the 16th century as a kind of major, he's how to say, he's not Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas might be compared with Jiva Goswami, but anyway, we call him the Rasa Acharya, the teacher for this aesthetics of theology. And what I wanted to call attention to is that at the end of her book, Michelle Voss Roberts calls attention to one particular rasa, which means a particular flavor or mood, which is, in Sanskrit, it's called adbhuta, which means something like wonder. wonder, amazement, and all the associations of that. And the point she's making, which I find interesting, is that this rasa can be a vehicle for connecting one's own tradition with another tradition. One can experience another tradition with a sense of wonder.
Yep.
As opposed to, we're right and they're wrong and so on.
Yeah.
But rather to say, oh, that is wonderful, how they perceive, how they understand God. That is, and that expands my appreciation, my understanding of God from my perspective.
Yeah, I must read that book, obviously. I have to go now. I'm sorry to say that.
we didn't discuss the time.
Can I say, Kenneth, it's been marvelous to talk with you again. And I think we've covered some interesting ground that has certainly increased my appreciation of how you see things and what you have to say. So thank you very much.
Well,
cool, yeah.
I do thank Keith, and I have to apologize also that I'm hardly in Oxford since a few years now, since
right.
Well, since we lost our house on Divinity Road.
Yes.
But I do look forward to my next visit to Oxford, and I do hope I'll be able to see you then when I come.
Yes.
I assume you're still living outside Oxford.
I am, yes. But I've still got a Christchurch email address. If you appear in Oxford, I will be delighted to come and see you wherever you are.
Thank you.
And we can communicate in language, the meaning of which will remain obscure
Indeed.
to everyone else but us.
Yes.
So,
cool. I just wanted to make a few final comments. I've been letting you go, but you guys speak. But with regards to your point about language, I think there's something to it. For example, we don't find medical professionals who don't speak English struggling to carry out their medical duties just because they use a different language. However, they may adopt terminology, but that's just terms. You can add them to any language. We can borrow terms from Sanskrit or from Greek or so on. And English itself is a hodgepodge language. So I think there's something to that. And I mean, the Vedic idea does say that there's some spiritual vibration contained in the Sanskrit language, but Prabhupada did teach, better to sing bhajans in English, so at least you could understand it. And whenever you sang a bhajan, he said you need to read the English translation, because what's more important is getting the semantic content rather than the spiritual vibration. It's not like pixie dust that you just sprinkle on yourself by chanting the mantras. It's about having the correct understanding. So I like that point with regards to language.
Yep.
Cool. Any final comments?
No, I think the whole subject of language and its uses in religion is a fascinating one, which still needs to be explored a lot. We've only touched the fringes of it, but I think there are especially sacred uses of language. And the job of a philosophically minded person is to ask exactly what that use is and what it conveys about the truth. Yes. And I think in the end, different faiths which use different forms of language need to learn from each other to extend their understanding of the universe and of the divine.
What I personally find I get from studying other faiths is that when you're stuck within your own faith, you can actually forget the essence and be stuck on the externals. But then when you peer into another faith and you start to see the we use the word bhakti, the love of God, the devotion contained by these members of another faith with completely different externals, then you're reminded of the essence.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. The
right.
Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, sort of tells the story of how all of this became such a problem. And it's interesting to imagine, maybe this is utopian imagination, a world in which we could very easily cross the boundaries that are seemingly so insurmountable, cross the boundaries of language by some deeper communication.
Yep, I'll mention that.
All right, we can wrap it up there. Thanks for coming on. I can't wait to have you on again. I'd quite like to interview Keith Ward one-on-one on epistemology or conceptions of God or something like that. So we'll see if we can organize that. We could do many topics. That's limitless.
Great talk. Yeah,
cool.
You.
So thanks for tuning in. If you like this, you can hit the like button and subscribe. If you want to see more of this content, and in the stream there, I don't have an outro video because I'm doing it a slightly different way than usual. So it ends here. Hare Krishna.